Good afternoon, everyone. This is Russ Harrison. I'm the Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is the June 13th, 2019 legislative update. We are currently sitting right in the middle of one of the busiest periods in Washington's legislative year. All the members of Congress are very interested in getting a few things done, or preferably many things done, but that seems optimistic. A few things done before they head home for the August recess. They need something to tell their voters that they were doing here in Washington. And so June and July, May, are typically intense periods of activity where Congress tries to at least move a few key bills forward. And we're certainly seeing that this year. A tremendous amount has happened, some of it just in the last couple days, on issues that we care about, and we expect that to continue until everybody goes home for August. And so we're going to touch on some of that. We're not going to have time to get to everything, but we'll touch on some of those activities and let you know what Congress is thinking about doing. And with that, a little political update to get us started. The first Democratic presidential debate is going to be the evenings of June 26th and 27th. The deadline for qualifying was actually yesterday, although they haven't, at least not as of a couple hours ago, put out a final list of who will be appearing. There are about 24 kind of mainstream real candidates. There's actually over 200 people technically running for the Democratic nomination, but most of them are just people who threw their hat in because they thought it was funny. But there's 24 candidates. To qualify for the debate, candidates either need to have 25,000 individual donors spread across 20 states, that is at least one donor in at least 20 states, or reach at least 1% in 3 public opinion polls selected by the Democratic Party. So it's not just any public opinion poll. They have a list of polls they're looking at, although they're not telling anybody what that list is. And so you either have to have the 25,000 contributors or reach 1% in the polls. There are 14 candidates that have done that have done both of those things, and 6 that have done one. So as of Monday, we knew that there would be 20 candidates participating. Again, there might be 4 more that squeak in, probably not all 4, but there might be 4 more. But you know, even if they don't, that gives 10 people at both of the debates, which is a lot of people. As the Republicans found out in 2016, it's really hard to do a debate with that number of people. As a consequence, so what the Democrats are going to do is they're going to randomly assign the 20 or 24 candidates to the 2 nights. So there's not going to be an A debate and a B debate where all the good candidates are at one and all the not so good candidates are the other. There's supposed to be a mix. Overall, I think the Democrats' approach on this is actually very smart, given the inherent difficulty of dealing with this many real candidates. But I think, as we mentioned on this call before, we're going to see big fields of candidates for president frequently in the future, and the parties are going to have to get a better handle on this faster because, you know, with 10 or 12 people on the stage, each candidate's only going to be able to talk for 5 to 10 minutes over a 2-hour debate. It's hard to really get noticed when that's all you're doing, and so what ends up happening is to get noticed, you have to say something obnoxious or shocking or really funny, and it's hard for these guys to be funny. And so, the most irritating candidate wins, because even if you're obnoxious, if you make the nightly news the next day, you still won. And if you're polite and courteous and reasonable, nobody's going to report on that. And I think that's a problem for the process, and it's a problem for the Democrats this year, and it'll be a problem moving forward. So enough about politics. Let's talk policy. I'm sure most of you are aware of the White House rules on accessing Huawei, Chinese telecommunication company. Rules were put in place in the last couple weeks, making it harder for American companies and institutions to work with Huawei. The executive order the president put out, technically if you read the order, says that companies, institutions in the United States can't do business with companies that are deemed a national security threat, which Huawei has been deemed. We are now hearing that the administration may delay the implementation of their ban. It turns out that Huawei products are really, really important to things like rural broadband, rural hospitals, and it's not clear that simply excluding them from the U.S. Is going to work. This is all part of the administration's ongoing effort to protect American IP from theft from overseas actors, by which they mean predominantly China. Government, keep in mind, the administration, I should say, prohibited the government from using Huawei technology last year, so this is just building on what they've already done. Of interest to IEEE in particular, China has countered that if the restrictions go into place, they may put restrictions on the sale of rare earth elements to the United States, to companies that abide by the ban, to other countries. It's not clear exactly what they would do. What is clear is that a huge percentage of the rare earths that technology needs, cell phones and other things, need to operate, are currently coming from China. And so if China were to restrict them, that would be a big deal to technology manufacturers all over the world. My understanding is the price for rare earths has already jumped in anticipation for this happening. And so regardless of the specific restrictions that were put on Huawei, we have a destabilization of kind of the tech environment, which is going to take a little while to dissipate. On to less exciting things. The fiscal 2020 budget is moving through Congress. 10 of the 12 appropriations bills have been passed out of House committee. That's the first step into getting actual text, but we do have text. Although of those 10 that have passed out of committee, and this is just the House and it's just committee, nothing's come to the floor yet. The legislative service bill may get delayed. Legislative services pays for Congress, and typically it is the very first appropriations bill passed because Congress wants to make sure their lights stay on first. But efforts coming from a couple legislators to include language raising congressional pay are complicating that bill all of a sudden, and it might actually get delayed. So we may only be at 9 of 12. The Senate is just getting started. As you all know, the Senate can't act until the House acts because that's what the Constitution says. So the Senate is usually behind, but it's a little bit more behind than usual. Congress is still kind of on track for finishing the budget by October 1st. It's not going to, but it's moving along at a little bit behind schedule pace, but then again, they started late because the 19 budget was completed so late. But the Republican Senate leaders met with White House budget folks yesterday, actually I think it was on Tuesday, to talk about what the Senate is going to do about these bills. There are a couple big issues that still need to be worked out. The biggest by far are the spending caps and deficits. Technically, sequestration is still in place, and those rules that were passed during the Obama administration call for some rather substantial reductions in discretionary spending, reductions that would affect every budget across the entire government. It is unlikely that those are actually going to be put in place, but how Congress gets around them, whether they remove them, whether they ignore them, whether they implement them differently, implement them less, but still do something, all those issues still need to be worked out. And it's not clear what they're going to do about them. All of which has to do with the deficits. As I mentioned last month, deficits are a problem. According to federal budget folks, the United States will be entering a debt spiral in about 5 years. That is, we're going to have to start borrowing money to pay back the money that we borrowed, which is not healthy. Then you have some social issues that are complicating the budget. The president looks like he's going to ask for money for his border walls. The Senate is probably going to put that into their budget. The Democrats obviously don't want that. The Democrats have had noise about removing what's called the Hyde Amendment. That is a rule prohibiting federal funds to be spent on abortion. Obviously, that's a problem for Republicans. So when you start having these kind of social issues leak into the budget, it gets very, very complicated. So where are we specifically? Looking again, these numbers are just out of the House. So these are effectively Democratic budget numbers at the moment. Most of the votes on the appropriations bills were more or less party line votes. But National Science Foundation is up 6.7%. Space technology up nearly 40%, which is very exciting. They're looking at moon bases and trips to Mars and things like that and getting us ready to start doing those really exciting things. NIST is up 5.5%, which is basically exactly what we asked for. The Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, which the White House and some Republicans have tried to get rid of, has a nice increase of 10%. The one area where we did not see significant or really nice increases, frankly, DARPA was up about 2.8%, but DoD's Science and Tech Basic Research budget, that's the 6.1 budget, was down 4.3%. I should point out that there's some overlap between the DARPA number and the DoD S&T number, so they're not entirely independent things, but DoD basic research spending was cut a little bit. Office of Science, Department of Energy Office of Science, again, which was slated to get a sizable cut by the administration, is actually up 4.3%, a little less than we were hoping for, but still pretty good. However, as I mentioned, these are all Democratic numbers. They're coming out of the House, which is controlled by the Democrats, where the minority can be mostly ignored on these sorts of things. So we should see these numbers as kind of, except for the Defense Department, the best case scenarios. What's happening is the Democrats are establishing a negotiating position that they will then take into conference with the Senate once the Senate finishes their talking point numbers. So the Senate will pass their appropriations bills, the House will pass their appropriation bills. They will not be the same bills. They will then go to conference committee where they will scream at each other for a couple days and will or won't come out with a compromise budget. And so while these numbers are quite good so far, this is the good news. The bad news is still coming, and we're not sure what those are yet. However, all things being equal, starting out from a position of strength with nice budget numbers is better than not doing that. So we're happy so far, but there's a really, really long way to go before we actually get a 2020 budget. Oops. Sorry about that. A little noted bill popped out of Maine, of all places. Maine has passed a digital privacy bill that prohibits ISPs from using, selling, or distributing personal data without consent. This is interesting, not necessarily because of what the bill does, because ISPs really aren't the big problem. The big problem are websites, Facebook, Google, Amazon, acquiring personal data and selling it. And the Maine law says nothing about websites because it can't, because the websites aren't located in Maine. And so you get into federalism issues of interstate commerce and all that. But Maine can regulate ISPs in the state of Maine, of which there are no particularly big ones, because Maine is not a particularly big state. But what this bill demonstrates again is that if Congress can't get its act together and act on digital privacy, which much of society is now demanding, we're going to end up with this patchwork of laws affecting different states differently. And for a technology that is so global as the internet, that's really the wrong way to do it. And so IEEE-USA is continuing to talk to Congress about digital privacy and trying to nudge them into taking actual action. The problem is everybody knows you can't do this. One party can't do this. There needs to be a bipartisan solution, and so far they haven't figured out what that would be. But things like Maine and California's law and a number of other states are looking in this area. We hope will start to push them into actual action. IEEE-USA is currently tracking over 20 AI-related bills in Congress. The bills are coming from both chambers, both parties, multiple committees. Some of them are bipartisan, some of them are just one legislator, all of which demonstrates that Congress really hasn't decided what it wants to do about this yet. And these bills are an effort, part of an effort for legislators to get their heads around what should be done. But the 20 bills, and there are more that we're not necessarily paying that much attention to, the bills can be kind of divided and broken up into three buckets. There are bills designed to ensure that the government, and in some cases private industry, has access to AI professionals, and that's especially the Defense Department. These bills include money for universities, programs to help community colleges, In some cases, money to help companies pay to educate their own workforce or to, find their own workers and get them trained up, as well as efforts within the Defense Department to provide special promotional tracks, special recruitment things, incentives or programs to make sure the military has access to AI experts. Then you have the privacy bills that want to make sure that AI doesn't violate people's privacy, that it is ethically implemented, that it is responsibly implemented. These bills tend to be the least well-formed. Congress is really trying to get their heads around this one, and they're pretty far off, I think, still. But it's also where IEEE-USA is the most active, trying to help Congress understand the potential, the risks, the promise, and to help them balance all of these things in a way that doesn't harm the American public. Then you have some much more simple bills that are designed to help the government actually use AI technologies to deliver services. That includes the Defense Department, if you want to consider a bomb a service, but also, the rest of the federal government trying to use AI to run more efficiently, run more effectively, and just do a better job at all that it does. So Congress is spending a lot of time on this. It's going to be a little while before a lot of these issues gel so that we know specifically what the key bills are. We know some of them, but there's still a lot of play here. But Congress is focusing on this, and they're trying to get ahead of the curve, or at least not get too far behind the curve, and they're trying to do some innovative things, which is good. They don't do a lot of that anymore, but in this issue, they're doing their best. I'm sure many of you have seen the news looking at the tech companies as monopolies, as threats to the country in one way or another, and we're seeing increased calls in Congress and in Washington to do things to rein in or break up the tech companies. A couple things that have just popped up. The Senate just announced that they will be doing a hearing on the federal government's look into monopolistic behavior by the tech companies. Specifically, the Senate wants to know why the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice have kind of broken up inquiries into different types of possibly monopolistic, possibly illegal activity by the tech companies, instead of having it all handled by the Department of Justice. The exact nature of that hearing isn't what's important. What's important is the Senate is weighing into the debate, and they're becoming more involved. This is on top of investigations. Ireland's being very aggressive. European Parliament, the EU rather, is getting involved in investigating monopolistic behavior by the tech companies. I'm not saying they are being monopolistic. I'm just saying there's investigation going into whether they are or not. Also probably noteworthy that Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, has called for the breakup, the explicit breakup of 4 technology companies, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Senator Warren is kind of in the middle, depending how you define things, of the second tier of candidates for president. You have Vice President, former Vice President Joe Biden, and then a collection of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, maybe one other one, depending on how you count, who are kind of the second tier, and then you drop off. So Warren is not a top candidate yet, but she's getting close. And the fact that she's using this issue to get attention for herself is telling. And I suspect more candidates will start talking about this in the future because it got her some really nice press, and that's really what they're after. Not to say she's not being sincere about this, but from a campaign standpoint, it worked pretty well. A couple updates on immigration reform. The Keep STEM Talent Act has been introduced in the Senate. It is a simply green cards for graduate students bill. It is an uncapped program, so it basically says if you are a student that meets these criteria, you get a green card, which we think is great. We've endorsed the bill. It was introduced by our friend Senator Dick Durbin, who has been one of our 2 leading champions in Congress on these issues for a very, very long time. It is co-sponsored by Senator Harris, Klobuchar, Blumenthal, and Wyden. You will all immediately notice that all those names are Democrats. 2 of them, by the way, Harris and Klobuchar, are running for president. Senator Durbin worked extremely hard, his staff, I should say, worked extremely hard to find a Republican to sign on to this bill, and we had talked to a number of offices as well. There is support for this approach, maybe not this exact bill, but something similar to it, among Republicans in the Senate and also, frankly, in the House. The problem is no Republican wanted to be the first Republican to put their name on a bill that was explicitly Democratic on this particular issue. Immigration has become so polarized that nobody wanted to get out ahead of it. But if we can get this bill to start to move, if it looks like it starts to have traction, if it looks like it's going to be seriously discussed, there are a couple of Republican offices that are likely to come out in favor of it. And if it starts to move and if there are actual votes, there's actually pretty broad support for a bill like this. There would have to be some tweaks and some changes and some adjustments, but the basic approach is fairly popular. On a related note, the House looks likely to move on its country cap bill sometime in July, probably. The plan was to move that bill after the House acted on Dreamers, which they have now done. The House has a bill to legalize a large number of people that came here illegally. That bill is not likely to go anywhere, but the Democrats in the House promised to do it, and they now have, so they can now turn to the country cap bill. The House bill, country cap bill, has over 300 co-sponsors, which is pretty good since you only need 235 to actually pass. But we've talked to a number of offices, and the support for the bill is actually pretty soft. Most legislators don't really understand the bill. They don't understand the implications. They don't understand the downside. Just for the record, IEEE-USA is in favor of getting rid of the country caps in the EB Green Card program. Our concern is that if that is all you do, and that is all the House bill does, you end up creating a great deal of problems for a lot of people. Essentially, the EB Green Card program becomes a almost exclusively Indian visa program for 5 years or so, and then some folks from China can come in, some folks from the Philippines. So it's going to be 7 to 8 years before anybody outside of India and China can get a high-skill visa. And given the number of people that are in our schools from places other than India and China that are expecting to get a visa within a year or two of graduating, that's a big deal, and that's a problem. So we are looking for ways that we can reach a compromise where we can get the people who are currently waiting in line a visa very quickly, but not disadvantage the people who are about to get in line. And frankly, the only way to do that is with more visas, which is why we like to keep STEM Talent Act and other bills like it. The FCC just announced that it is going to produce a detailed broadband map. That is a map of the broadband speeds across the country. We have pieces of that. We have kind of general maps out there. But right now, there's no way to tell exactly how fast the internet is at any given address. And I'm not sure the map will ultimately be quite that granular. But IEEE-USA has been pushing this for a very long time, and we're excited that the FCC is finally going to do it. It should prove to be invaluable in our efforts to promote rural broadband and to bring high-speed internet to America's rural and isolated communities. It's fairly easy to provide high-speed internet in a city or a dense suburb, but many, many Americans don't live in cities and inner suburbs. And providing broadband to less populated areas is very hard, but also very important because those are the areas that can most benefit from high-speed internet because they tend to be the most isolated. So we applaud the FCC for doing this and look forward to the results of their studies, which we won't have for a while yet. But the fact that they've committed to doing it is still something worth applauding. Senator Coons has introduced his long-expected patent reform bill. This happened just this week, so we don't actually have a text or even a bill number just yet. But it will reform Section 101 of the Patent Act, which IEEE-USA has been calling for way too long, 7 or 8 years now. Just a note, some of the press reports on this bill said that it would allow genes and other biological systems to be patented. That is not the case. Though you still will not be able to patent individual genes, much to the chagrin of the pharmaceutical and biological sciences industries. but something that is probably a good idea. IEEE-USA will likely be endorsing the bill. Frankly, we don't want the gene patenting issue to get into this bill because it'll create enormous controversy and make sure nothing gets passed. We will likely be endorsing the bill. Like I said, we haven't actually read the final text of the bill yet. We saw drafts of it. And until we do, I don't want to say we'll endorse it, but we almost certainly will. An issue that pops up frequently, but I just want to highlight, there was an amendment added to the House Legislative Services Appropriations Bill. And like I mentioned, that passed committee, but is now kind of being pulled into controversy over Senate pay. But this was also added to that bill. It's not terribly controversial, at least in the House. But what the amendment would do was recreate the Office of Technology Assessment, which is a piece of Congress that existed for a while that provided legislative offices with unbiased technical advice, explaining technology, explaining what could be done, explaining technical terms, frankly, doing a lot of the things that IEEE-USA does on the Hill. The program, the office, I should say, was eliminated in 1995 for a couple reasons. One, this is when the Republicans controlled the House and they were trying to reduce the deficit and they were trying to streamline the government. They thought, some legislators said that this program was unnecessary. There was also concerns from some Republican offices that the OTA had become biased, that they were providing advice that benefited the Democrats. That is open to debate, but of course that's the point. Offices like this have to be seen as entirely unbiased by both sides or they stop being useful, because once one side doesn't trust them, it doesn't matter what advice they provide, no one's going to listen to them. So it was eliminated in 1995. Some people think that was okay, some people oppose it. Regardless, it went away. There is now an amendment in the House to recreate that program. There's also an effort going on in the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which is a piece of Congress that provides Congress with unbiased advice. It was originally designed to keep an eye on the budget, to do investigations to make sure federal money is being spent appropriately, being spent the way it was supposed to be spent. It has broadened its mandate over the years to just generally look into government programs in general to make sure they're running correctly. Kind of the Congress's auditing arm, you could think of it. They have explicitly been expanding their scientific and technology assessment team, which would do something very similar to the OTA. They actually came in and talked to IEEE-USA last year about ways they could do things better. So we have these two. They're not really competing, but there's similar efforts to bring advice, technical advice to Congress, which we think is a really good idea. The challenge is that you'll note we have two competing ideas on how to do this. The one in the House, it could be seen as a partisan effort. The fact that they're calling it the OTA, the Democrats who control the House are calling the OTA, is unfortunately designed to roll back some of the Republican forms of 1995. Whether they should be rolled back or not is one question. However, if you point out that you're rolling it back in the name of the program, this is currently a partisan play. If folks really just wanted to get an office back to provide tech assessment, they would have called it something else. The Senate effort to expand the GAO is a Republican play to counter the Democrats' play in the House, none of which is terribly helpful, because if this issue becomes partisan, the whole thing could fall apart, which would be a shame, because it is a good idea to have this advice available to Congress. So we're working with legislators to try to help them understand that this is a good idea outside of partisan politics, and that there are a number of ways you can solve this problem, and they should really do one of them and not make this a talking point on the campaign trail. We'll see how that goes. One interesting note on cybersecurity, the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act was introduced this week. Representative Grave and Gottemeyer, Republican and a Democrat, so that's useful, and 14 co-sponsors. This is designed to allow companies to go on offense when it comes to cyber defenses. It allows companies to take actions to determine who hacked them and where their stolen data went, which would mean counter-hacking the hackers. They would then be able to gather data to provide to the police to do criminal investigations, to bring lawsuits and whatever, make arrests. It's important to note the Act does not allow companies to retaliate. So they can't hack the hackers and delete things or disable servers or whatever else you can do when you hack someone. It just allows them to go in and figure out who did the actual hacking and where their data is, and then provide that information to the police. It's also useful to note that the law protects companies from criminal prosecution if they hack into somebody else's servers. It doesn't protect them from civil lawsuits. So it's not quite clear how useful this would be. Would be prudent at this point to point out that a lot of companies are already doing this, and they're just looking for some cover. They just aren't talking about it yet. The bill is opposed by some law enforcement groups who are concerned that unskilled IT departments could kind of flounder around in cyberspace and actually destroy evidence that the government could have used to prosecute hackers. Not all companies have first-rate IT departments, and they can tip hackers off to how people are tracking what the hackers are doing, making the hackers better. They can destroy evidence. It's not clear just because Congress passes a law saying you can't be sued or arrested for doing this, that information discovered by private companies who are hacking into another organization, that information would be admissible in court. So there's all sorts of legal issues. But the fact that this bill was introduced, the fact that it is bipartisan support and reasonably good support with 16 legislators on board already, indicates that Congress is looking at ways to become more aggressive in the cyber space, and that Congress is willing to start to think about things that it wasn't willing to think about 5 years ago. I suspect we'll see more bills like this. I don't expect this bill to pass, but it is clearly an indicator of where Congress is thinking and where they're moving. All right, folks, our next legislative update will be July 18th, 1 o'clock. Again, Thursday, 1 o'clock, same time, same place, next month. And with that, Diana, do we have any questions?
Yes, I have received 3 questions so far.
Okay.
The first is Congress doing anything to attract more students to engineering?
It's a good question. There are a number of pieces of legislation in Congress trying to look at ways to attract students not just into engineering, but into the STEM fields in general. These can be divided into, I guess, 3 basic categories. There's bills designed to attract students to the STEM fields by improving K through 12 education. Those are almost all money bills. We want to spend more money on K through 12 STEM education in the local schools. The problem with all those bills is that there's no money. All those would need new money. There are, and this is more important, I think, we want more money for K through 12 education, but there's a couple bills out there looking at ways to improve the climate within the STEM fields, and particularly looking at sexual harassment and other types of harassment. IEEE-USA has been active in those discussions. I'm frankly proud to say that IEEE generally has been much better at getting ahead of these issues than a lot of the groups out there. But it's a tough one to deal with. When you're talking about sexual harassment at universities, in federal labs, those are fairly easy, but then you look at conferences and other things like that, it becomes harder. And then you have some bills designed to help private companies educate their own workforce, tax breaks, tax credits, partnerships with community colleges, things like that, all of which have potential. I can say, though, that IEEE-USA used to be a lot more active on this particular issue than we are now. We're working it, but we're not working it that aggressively because about 8 years ago, there was a big push to get a chunk of new money to support K through 12 education, which we got. And while getting that money, IEEE-USA got language inserted in federal law, making it clear that federal money to support K through 12 STEM included engineering, which it now does, and computer science, which it now does. Frankly, just simply attracting students to the fields were a little short of ideas. More money would be helpful, but more money is hard to come by. And beyond that, we're not quite sure what else will work. And so if anybody listening to this conversation has ideas on things the federal government can do to encourage more students, particularly women and minorities, to enter the STEM fields, I would very much love to hear them. Diana?
Yes, the next question I received is, does Maine's digital privacy bill have implications for national ISPs that also operate in Maine or only for companies headquartered within the state?
That's a good question. And the answer is it's not entirely clear, but probably no. Maine has the authority to regulate companies within Maine. And so ISPs that sell their services to Maine residents only and who are located in Maine can be regulated by the Maine legislature. Once you're looking at ISPs from outside of the state who are selling services into Maine, that becomes interstate commerce, which is clearly the jurisdiction of the federal government. Now, having said that, just because the surface understanding of the law says that no, Maine can't regulate those ISPs, does not mean Maine isn't going to try to regulate those ISPs, which could make life complicated for those ISPs. Plus, then there are questions about what does it mean to be located in Maine? I mean, these are cyber companies. If you have a sales force in Maine who are selling to Maine customers, does that mean technically the Maine legislature can regulate those guys? So this is exactly the issue that I was talking about, where having state law trying to regulate the internet, or in this case ISPs, which isn't exactly regulating the internet, but it's pretty close, gets really messy, really fast. And so we currently have a set of laws in California. We now have a smaller set of laws in Maine. Frankly, there's a set of laws in Europe. All of these things conflict because a lot of the companies are selling across state boundaries, across international boundaries, and the nature of the internet means that's what you're supposed to be doing. And we want them to do that. But it means we really need the federal government to step up and establish the rules, because these little 50 sets of rules on how you operate on the internet, it just isn't going to work. So the immediate answer to your question is probably not, but it is going to make it more complicated for ISPs to operate within the United States, which raises costs. And as more and more states develop different rules with different regulations and different boundaries, it's going to become very messy very quickly. Diana?
Yes, I've received a couple more questions, actually. Upon completion of the broadband map, what kind of next steps are to be expected? Given insight into internet speeds, would we expect resultant investment from the private sector, or would it be up to policymakers to use the map as a guide for targeted initiatives?
Yes. The purpose of the map is to help the federal government understand where there are holes and to better understand, and it's not just, there's no broadband, there's lots of versions of broadband, and IEEE-USA, by the way, has told legislators broadband users need to be able to stream video. And if the broadband is fast enough to do that, that's good enough. Now, over time that may change, but I think that's a pretty decent working definition for the moment. So the government can say, okay, this town has broadband, but it's not fast enough to do high-speed video, which means you can't do telemedicine and a few other things. So we need to target investment here. And that's where the map will be most immediately useful. There is a pot of money to help the federal government get rural and underserved communities wired. There are a couple bills in Congress to provide more money to do that. But before the government can do that effectively, we need to know where that money needs to be spent, and that's what the map will do. Now, in addition to helping the government, the broadband map can also obviously be used by the private sector to say, oh, shoot, we have a big hole right here. Nobody is serving this community. We can move in and provide a service there that they don't currently have. So it should also spur private sector investment, but that's not technically its purpose. It's just a fringe benefit, I suppose. Diana?
Okay, the next question I received was they would like to hear more about the GAO expansion. You had mentioned that the OTA revival could be seen as partisan. Did you say the GAO expansion could be seen similarly? I would think an expansion of an existing nonpartisan organization would be the preferred approach of a nonpartisan.
I think you're generally correct, and frankly, that's why IEEE-USA, we don't have a position on which option is better, but I tend to think the GAO approach is a better one. I mean, it already exists. We might as well use it. The partisan issue here is that the GAO began walking down this path as a response to Democrats' calls to recreate the OTA. And so it was created, I shouldn't say that, the effort began because Republicans didn't want the Democrats to recreate the OTA. And so there's kind of a taint in the creation of the program because the Democrats were trying to do something and then the Republicans moved to stop them by doing the GAO. So as policy, I think you're entirely right. And what the GAO is doing is not partisan and there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. Whereas what the Democrats are doing with the OTA, the structure and the language around what they're doing is frankly designed to be anti-Republican. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means that's how they're structuring it. And so when you put the two of them together within Washington, D.C., where normal people logic doesn't always apply, the GAO could be seen as a Republican partisan response to a Democratic partisan action. And we are trying to make sure that doesn't happen because both the OTA and the GAO are good ideas, and now we're discussing which of the good ideas are better, and that's a more useful conversation to have. Diana?
The final question that I received is there a new risk of a government shutdown coming up? This is related to the debt ceiling debate.
There was never, the risk of a shutdown never went away, so it's not really a new risk. It's always been there. You are correct to point out, however, that this year we have a couple different possible shutdowns. The debt ceiling debate could cause a government shutdown. The federal government is legally prohibited from borrowing beyond a certain point. And since the deficit, I was just reading today, for the first 8 or 9 months, wherever we are at this point, of the 2019 fiscal year, keeping in mind the fiscal year starts October 1st, we're at $785 billion, which is huge. So once the federal government can't borrow any more money, we run out of money very quickly, which causes a number of programs to shut down. That could lead to a shutdown of the government. Then you have the 2020 federal budget appropriation process, which is the normal source of a federal shutdown. That could also happen. We are pretty far away from being able to know how either one of those things will work out. In other words, we have several months before either one of those becomes a real problem. Congress is already talking about doing a CR or an omnibus to take care of the federal appropriations budget problem. That would probably be a November or December play. The federal, it's actually really hard to figure out when the government hits the debt ceiling. That would, I'm hearing, would be late summer, early fall, so August, more likely September. There always seems to be additional money they find when these things happen, so possibly into October before that happens. I suspect the debt ceiling will be taken care of. They'll be whining, they'll be yelling, it'll go down to the last minute, but they will probably eventually, I mean, they have to. They have to extend the debt ceiling unless they want to do massive budget cuts all of a sudden this fall, and they don't want to do that. The federal budget is the bigger problem at the end of the year. There's not a huge amount of appetite for a shutdown, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. And so I think that's how it'll play out, and we'll know better, this fall, whether it's going to be a bad shutdown or a brief one, or any at all. They could avoid it entirely. Diana, was there any other questions?
Nope, I have read all of the questions that I have received. Wonderful.
Well, I'm Russ Harrison, and should anybody else have questions, things that you think about, things you hear between now and July 13th, My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My direct line is 202-530-8326. Thank you for your help today, Diana. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to talking with you all again next month. Happy 4th of July.